Test, test. Good? Okay. All right, so we'll pick up where we left off last week. Let me try to kind of summarize where we were, though. So I think we got down to around 720, 17, something like that. So at that point, what has happened is Israel is gone. So Israel has been eliminated by Assyria. Most of the people have been taken into captivity. And Assyria has repopulated Israel with people from all over the Assyrian Empire. So you have a lot of different religions, pagan people have moved in, and so forth into that area. As far as Judah goes, Judah was kind of avoiding disaster. They weren't really in any kind of argument with Assyria until the 730s or so, when they were threatened by Israel and Syria, when those two countries wanted Judah to join them in a threefold revolt against Assyria. And when King Ahaz said no thanks, then they turned on him and said, well, we'll just fight you and get you off the throne and put somebody on the throne that will go with us to join us to fight Assyria. And when that happened, Ahaz panicked, asked Assyria to help him, and Assyria took his money and came in and defeated Syria and Israel. So at that point, so when you're in like the 720s or so and 17s, what has happened is Syria, or what we might call Aram, or the capital city is Damascus, that is now a vassal state of Assyria because Assyria beat them. Assyria has beaten Israel, so Israel is now a vassal state. And Judah is still a country, but they are a vassal state now of Assyria. And so we left off last week at a time when Assyria was starting to have some issues back home, and they got a new king. Let me see what's on this particular slide. Let me just back up maybe one slide here. A couple more. Yeah, we didn't get to that yet. Okay, so I think this is where we left off. We got down to 705, and what happens is Sargon II dies, and he's replaced by Sennacherib. Sennacherib is the last of the four kings we're going to talk about for the purpose of this book. So he's king of Assyria, and he takes over for Sargon II. But when he takes over, there's some problems back home in the east that he has to deal with. And so he's dealing with these issues back east for a while, and he kind of takes his eye off what's happening in the west where Judah is located. So over in the west, where you have Judah and Phoenicia and the Philistine states and Egypt and countries like Ammon and Moab and Edom and those places, they realize Assyria is not really paying attention to them, even though they're vassal states of Assyria. And they decide, hey, this is probably the time to revolt because Assyria is a little weaker right now and they're not really paying attention to us. And so each of those countries starts developing kind of a national pride. We want to get back to our old ways. We don't want to be submissive to this major world power. And on top of that, Egypt starts fanning the flames and kind of pushes them in the same direction to say, hey, once you guys revolt, we'll help you and so forth. And so the countries revolt and they quit paying the tribute money. And so for a while that works because Assyria is not really able to pay attention to them. And so Hezekiah is king of Judah when this happens. And he quits paying the tribute money, and he starts doing some things back home to that would be against what Assyria would want. So what's happening back east that draws Assyria's attention in that direction? Well, let me go back to I'll show you here on this map. Well, I'll show you the slide, and then I'll show you the map. Okay, so if you remember when we talked last week, so technically Assyria and Babylon are two different countries, but they're located side by side. But for a lot of the history of those two countries, they function as one country. And what do I mean by that? Is they have one king that rules over both of them. And so sometimes it's a Babylonian king that's ruling over the whole area. Sometimes it's an Assyrian king ruling over both areas. And so at this particular time, Assyria is in charge, and so the Assyrian king technically is over both areas. But what's happening is in Babylon, you're starting to have a revolt, okay? And so the people in Babylon are trying to branch away again from Assyria. And so you got a guy in Babylon named Merodach-Baladan, is his name, and he takes control of the city of Babylon after Sargon dies. And so when Sennacherib takes over, he's having this issue of a revolt in Babylon where they're trying to separate from Assyria. So he had previously had some control of or independence in Babylon during Sargon II, but after Sargon dies, he kind of ramps it up. And so he not only does he try to take over Babylon, but he tries to solicit foreign aid to help him establish Babylon as a separate state from Assyria. So what he does is he sends an envoy to Judah to meet with King Hezekiah, and you can read about that in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And this is the time when Hezekiah makes a big mistake, and it doesn't come out and say exactly what the mistake is in the Bible. It says what it is, but it doesn't say why it was a mistake. So when the envoy comes to Judah, Hezekiah welcomes them, but he shows them all of the wealth of the country, and he shows them the armory and everything. And it doesn't say this in the Bible why that's a problem, but the reason it's a problem is because you wouldn't show your armory and all your wealth unless you were going to make a military pact with another country, okay? So again, it's the same situation where God had told them don't make pacts or don't make agreements with other countries. I am your God. I am the only person you need to deal with. And so Hezekiah is basically making a pact with Babylon against Assyria. So all these countries in the west are trying to revolt against Assyria, but now you're aligning yourself with another country in the east also against Assyria. And so does anybody remember what happens as a result of him doing this? This is the famous part where the prophet comes in, tells him you're going to die. He weeps. The prophet leaves. Then God tells the prophet, go back in, tell him I heard your prayer. You're going to live 15 more years. The handwriting on the wall story, if you remember that. So that's what this story comes from. And so as you look at the map, what's going on? This is Assyria at the time of Sennacherib. So the Sennacherib is the guy that's king at this point. And I'll see if I can get this to work. So the extent of the country goes almost down to Egypt. So it goes to Raphia right there where Judah is. And so they got control of all this area. But as you look here in the middle of the circle, there's a city called Ashur. It's actually misspelled there. It should be A-S-H-S-H-U-R. It's two S-H's. That's on the Tigris River. That's actually where the name of the country comes from. The name of the country in their language is actually Ashur, but we have Latinized it and made it called Assyria in English. But the name is really Ashur, is the name of the country. And so their main cities lie along the Tigris River, where Babylon, their main cities lie along the Euphrates River. And so the major city in Babylon is going to be Babylon itself, also the city of Ur, where Abraham was originally from, is in Babylon, okay? So what's happening is you have a kind of a revolt developing here immediately southeast of Assyria, as well as these countries over here are starting to try to separate from Assyria. And so Assyria is going to eventually put all this down and regain control of everything. But they've got some issues to deal with. Now, somebody asked me last week if I could point out the modern day countries and where they lie as compared to this particular map. I'll try to do my best with that. So Egypt is still Egypt, that hasn't changed. Where Judah is, that's still Israel. Obviously Jerusalem hasn't moved anywhere. Tyre, sorry, not Tyre, forget that. If you go down Ashkelon there, for instance, that's part of Palestine. So the Gaza area and all that's right on the coast right there. Then as you go up, Tyre and Byblos, which is called Phoenicia there, that's modern day Lebanon. Damascus and Syria there in the middle, that's still Syria. This whole middle part here, which is, it says Arabs there, this is Saudi Arabia. It's not on the map, but between the white and that next color right there is where Moab and Ammon would be, right on the edge of the eastern edge of Israel. And that would be where modern day Jordan is. And then as you go up, the Hittite area here, that is modern day Turkey. And then as you cut across, all this area of Assyria and Babylon, that's Iraq. And then as you go over where the Medes are, the Medes are Iran. And as you go up to where the Urartu is, that would be like where, probably like Afghanistan and some of those other countries that end in stan that you can't remember the names of. Some of those would be up in there, okay? So that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea where these players are. So as far as really from like history standpoint, Assyria and Babylon, that is Iraq, and the Medes and Persians, that's Iran, okay? That's the two countries today. Okay, any questions on that, just for curiosity? Okay. All right, so Assyria was distracted in the west. King Hezekiah starts to do reforms in Judah. So that's what he's kind of famous for from the Bible, is he actually tries to get the people back. So his father Ahaz was one of the worst kings of Judah and really took them into a lot of pagan idolatry and stuff. And Hezekiah tries to reverse all that as much as possible. And in doing that, he is actually revolting against Assyria by trying to eliminate a lot of this pagan stuff, okay? So he cleanses the temple of the foreign cults. That would be a declaration of independence from Assyria. He did actually plan a joint Passover with the remaining Israelites that were from Israel, the ones north of them, the ones that weren't taken into Assyrian captivity, but almost none of them showed up for this. But it was an attempt to try to reunite the country, but they weren't interested in doing that. He did remove the high places and the symbols, like the brazen serpent. He even did that in areas of Israel outside of the country of Judah. So in areas like Ephraim and Manasseh, he did eliminate some of this stuff. He did restore the service of the priests and the Levites, and he did expand and retook some of the area that used to be Judah that the Philistines had reclaimed from his father Ahaz. So he took some of this land back. He did form alliances, though, which he should not have done, with like the king of Ashkelon. Ashkelon is one of your Philistine cities, which would be in the modern day Palestine area. Egypt is kind of behind the scenes pushing all this and getting them to do this. So Palestine is sort of the initial defense for Egypt against Assyria. So when you go back at the map, why does Egypt care? Well, Egypt cares because the way to get from Assyria to Egypt, you go along this highway. So you don't cut straight across the desert. Like that would be a bad plan. There's no water through there. So if you want to go from, say, Nineveh to Jerusalem, you go up and over and down, okay? So if you want to get to Egypt, that's the way you go. So you have to go, you go along the coast here. And so Israel and Judah are on the highway between Egypt and Assyria. So why does Egypt want to encourage Phoenicia and Palestine and Judah and Israel and Moab and Ammon and all these countries to side with them? Well, they want them to side with them because they block Assyria from getting to them, right? So they're fanning the flames of, hey, yeah, revolt, 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 because that's the first people that are going to get fought when Assyria comes through. And so they want these people to weaken Assyria before they ever reach Egypt, okay? So that's why they want them to be on their side. All right. Okay, let me go back. All right, so Hezekiah forms alliances with the Philistines. He forms alliances with Egypt. Philistia and Phoenicia join in. And so King Hezekiah joins Phoenicia in withholding the tribute to Assyria. And this is probably the same time when he built the Hezekiah tunnel. So what he's doing is preparing Jerusalem for war in case they get sieged. So what did he just see happen to the capital of Israel, which is Samaria? Assyria came in and laid siege to the city and waited them out until they couldn't survive the siege anymore. Okay, so he didn't want the same thing to happen to Jerusalem. So he builds a tunnel which will filter water down to the pool of Siloam so that they'll have water supply even if they do suffer a siege. And so that tunnel is still there, as is, I think, part of the pool of Siloam may still be there. So you can read about that in Kings and Chronicles. So that's what he's doing when he's setting up this tunnel. So eventually Sennacherib, he gets things under control back east, and now he looks back west. In 701, he does defeat the Phoenicians and the Palestinians, aka the Philistine cities. He then starts making his way through what's called the Shephelah of Judah, so I'll show you what that is in a second. And he takes the fortified city of Lachish, which is a fortified city on the frontier of Judah. He also defeats the Egyptian forces, and Hezekiah is going to end up losing 46 fortified cities and a bunch of villages to Sennacherib. So if you go back to the map, what's going to happen? I think I have another map here in a second too. So Assyria is going to come this way. They're going to come up and down. And so what they'll do is they'll go along the Mediterranean coast here. But then when they want to turn their attention on Judah, you'll stop at, like, say, Ashkelon, for instance, and then you'll head back east, okay? So Jerusalem is in kind of a higher elevation. So if you want to go from the sea to Jerusalem, you have to go up, okay? And so the area, so if Jerusalem is this elevation and the sea's down here, the area in between, which is a lower elevation than Jerusalem, that's called the Shephelah. And it's just kind of a lower plain area. And so they're going to come through that first. And that's where Micah is from. And these fortified cities are in that area too. So Lachish, for instance, is in that area. And so these are going to be the cities they hit first as they come into the country. All right, so is all this made up nonsense that's just biblical stories, or is it real? All this is corroborated by the Assyrian record itself, okay? So the Assyrians wrote all this down. Everything that's in the Bible, the Assyrians talked about the same stuff. You can read it if you can read Akkadian. You can read it, and it's actually in the British Museum. So these wall reliefs that you see here in the British Museum were found in, I think, Sennacherib's palace. He had bragged about all these accomplishments he made when he came into Palestine and Judah and Israel and these different countries and took them over. And so he recorded all this. It's basically propaganda of how he bragged about everything he did. And so they found all these records, and everything that the Bible says is true. It's corroborated by Assyrian history as well. And so if you want to see it, you can go to the British Museum in London and see it. This is Lachish. Okay, so Lachish is a fortified high city. Obviously, it's an archaeology site now. It's not a place people live. But you get the idea that, so Hezekiah is going to lose 46 of these type of cities to Sennacherib. So they're cities built up on a hill, and at the top of the hill you have a fort, basically. And that way people could, flee to the fort or whatever the case. And so Lachish is a big one, and it's an important one. And so this is one of the ones he lost. So you can get an idea of how large it is. And so Sennacherib took at least 46 of these type cities from Hezekiah as he's moving towards Jerusalem to take Jerusalem. Okay, so this is the map, or the direction they would come. So I've kept saying this over and over. So Assyria is going to come down the coast. So Sidon is part of Phoenicia, as is Akko, I think. And then as you come down, you'll see Joppa there. And so you're going to go from Phoenicia to the Philistine cities, and then you're going to curve east. So you see Lachish down here at the bottom is that fortified city I just showed you. And you're going to curve up northeast from that if you want to go up to Jerusalem. And so that's the route Sennacherib and his army would take to go down the coast, go through Phoenicia, go through the Philistine cities, and then curve back to take care of business with Judah. Okay, so what happened here? So Sennacherib at this point, he's bragging about all the stuff he's done, because he's able to take this stuff pretty easily because they're a far superior military power than these small countries. And so he brags in his records that he had King Hezekiah of Judah shut up like, quote, a bird in a cage, okay? So he actually says that in his annals that he wrote. So he's mocking Hezekiah for the situation. He feels like he has him trapped, just like they had Samaria trapped, and he feels like he's got Hezekiah and Jerusalem trapped and ready to do the same thing to them. So he forces Hezekiah to pay heavy tribute that you can read about in 2 Kings 18. And this is some of the tribute that Sennacherib himself lists in his annals that he took. So he took 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver, precious stones, antimony, large cuts of red stones, couches with ivory, some type of chairs with ivory, elephant hides, ebony wood, boxwood, all kinds of valuable treasures. And then notice this, his own daughters. So he took some of Hezekiah's daughters, concubines, male and female musicians. Okay, so Hezekiah is losing a lot here, not only financially, but some of his own children, his concubines, and so forth. And this is before Jerusalem ever goes into a siege. This is just tribute, trying to get Sennacherib to not invade them, okay? So what happens, once the Assyrians make their way to Libnah, they make further demands. They want more tribute. And so Sennacherib brags that he exports over 200,000 people in total from the area back to Assyria. Judah was stripped of some of its territory, which went back to the Philistines in particular. But at the very last moment, God comes in and saves Judah and King Hezekiah by an angel of the Lord. If you remember the story, overnight, mysteriously 185,000 Assyrian soldiers are found dead in their camp. And at that point, Sennacherib is like, well, guess I'll go back home. I don't have a military anymore. So the only thing that saved them is God came in and intervened. Okay, so if you remember all the time, what did God tell them in Deuteronomy? Never make alliances with these foreign countries. You don't have to make alliances with these foreign countries. I will take care of you as long as you're faithful to me. And they never listened. They always made alliances with other countries. Even the best of their kings, like Hezekiah, is making alliances with other countries. But God spares them at this particular time, and he spares Hezekiah's life as well. And so God comes in, God intervenes, he destroys the Assyrian army, and Sennacherib goes back home to Assyria without actually laying siege to Jerusalem. So he got very close to Jerusalem, his army is destroyed, and he goes back home. So Jerusalem has actually never invaded at this particular time, okay? So at this point, he lives another 20-ish years, Sennacherib does, and he never comes back to Judah. He doesn't bother them again. So he gets pretty humiliated with this defeat, and he doesn't go back to Judah. And not only that, but he ends up getting assassinated by two of his own sons in 681, and I think one of them takes over. I don't really remember the story exactly, but that kind of starts the downslide of Assyria, unfortunately, or from an Assyrian standpoint. Just to kind of fill you in on the rest of the story. So Sennacherib dies in 681. Which country ends up defeating Assyria eventually? Does anybody know? So it's Babylon, okay? So if you go back to the map, let me get back. So if you go back and you look at this map, so right now, Assyria and Babylon are one country, but they're really two countries but ruled by one king. You already have the workings of Babylon trying to separate from Assyria. They're not going to officially separate from Assyria until, I think it's, so Israel goes into captivity in 722. They go to Assyria. Sennacherib dies in 681. But then Assyria is going to keep on for about another 70 years. And I think, if I remember, I might have the year off a little bit. I think it's 611. Babylon is going to actually defeat Assyria, and Assyria is eliminated from history. They never come back from that. And so now Babylon becomes your main world power. And so who's going to take Judah into captivity? Well, it's Babylon, okay? So Babylon is then going to take Judah finally in 586, okay? So Assyria takes Israel into captivity. Assyria is the big player in the world scene for about 200 years or so. Then Babylon destroys them. Babylon becomes the big player in the scene for 100 years maybe, and they're the ones that take Judah into captivity. And then who comes in and destroys Babylon? The ones to the east of them, the Medes and Persians. They come in and destroy Babylon. And who lets the Jews go back home? Well, that's the Medes and Persians, all right? So as you look at the prophets, you're actually going to transition from the Assyrian age to the Babylonian age to the Medes and Persian age as you go down through time. So all this will become important history over time. But for right now, we're talking about Assyria. Okay, so Sennacherib's going to die in 681, and I think one of his sons takes over. So as far as the book of Micah, Micah really is prophesying during three kings, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So Hezekiah is going to die in 686. His son Manasseh is going to take over. So Hezekiah's father, Ahaz, was horrible. Hezekiah was good. Hezekiah's son, Manasseh, is horrible. Okay, so the two worst kings of Judah are Hezekiah's father and Hezekiah's son, with Hezekiah being one of the better ones, actually. And so it's kind of interesting that he's bookended by his relatives that are terrible. But anyway, Manasseh takes over. He's even worse than Ahaz was, probably the worst one in their history. But for Micah's purposes, Micah doesn't prophesy during Manasseh. So we're going to stop with Hezekiah. Okay, so Hezekiah is Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, which is what that says. All right, so the issue with Micah, you need to know all this historical stuff for the book to make sense. But the unfortunate thing about the book is Micah never says, this prophecy is occurring in this particular year while this particular historical event is happening, okay? So you kind of have to make some guesses. Okay, is he saying this because this is when this particular thing is happening? But the only thing you can really know is one of the particular prophecies happening during Hezekiah. The rest of them you kind of have to guess. But the whole book as a whole makes a lot more sense if you know the historical setting of what's going on. Okay, so during the first half of the 8th century, and we've talked about this already, Uzziah is king of Judah. So that's going to be like your 790s to 750s. Just remember when the BC you count down, not up, like we do in AD. So 790s to 750s, it's Uzziah, or actually into the 740s. He made Judah very wealthy, very powerful, but it all kinds of falls apart once he dies. But one of the downsides of the wealth and prosperity of Uzziah is that the rich get rich, but the poor don't necessarily get rich, okay? So you get more of a class separation, and the people that really get hit hard are the small farmers, and they're not able to, pay, for instance, the larger farms or the people that maybe own the farms or whatever the case may be. So the poorer person gets hurt in this situation. And remember, Micah is from a small farming community, and so that's going to be something he's very sensitive to, and he's going to talk quite a bit about that, or he's going to mention it some in the book. Ahaz's decision to become a vassal of Assyria is also a bad thing for the country's economy, and that's going to hurt them as a whole. Ahaz brought in a lot of pagan practices into the country. He even offered his own son as a sacrifice to a pagan god. So Isaiah indicts Judah for these things. Now remember, Isaiah and Micah do overlap each other. Isaiah prophesies mostly to the elite of Jerusalem, so to the king directly. He actually talks directly to King Ahaz, and as well as some other high court officials. Most scholars think Isaiah was part of the royal family or somehow had very easy access to them. So he was able to prophesy directly to the people who made the decisions, okay? Micah, on the other hand, is more of your average guy's prophet, okay? He's talking to the average citizens in Jerusalem, but they're probably both working in Jerusalem about the same time, but they're talking to different audiences, but they say a lot of the same stuff, okay? So Isaiah is going to indict Judah for a bunch of things like superstitious practices, oppression, violence, bloodshed, intemperance, insubordination, wickedness, injustice, materialism, and doing a lot of pagan, rituals and that kind of stuff. So these are some of the things Isaiah is going to talk about. So the city or the country as a whole have become pretty spiritually sick. So what I want you to kind of notice, when Israel was bad from the beginning, Judah trailed behind, okay? So everything Israel did, Judah also did. They just did it a little bit later on, okay? So you might think about it like this for our country and our purposes. Everything we're doing in our country, Europe did it about 30 or 40 years ago, okay? We're just in the exact same spot Europe is, just a little bit behind them, okay? So if things keep going in the same direction they're going right now, where will this country be in 30 or 40 years? Well, all you have to do is look at Europe, okay? How many people even go to church in Europe anymore? Almost nobody, okay? The church buildings are empty, nobody goes to them, they're nothing more than a nice, cute museum to go look at the pretty frescoes and all that stuff. But almost nobody goes to church in Europe. Nobody lives according to the Bible. Almost nobody believes the Bible in Europe anymore, okay? So where is the United States headed? If things don't change, that same place, okay? So when our kids and grandkids become adults, what will this country be like if it doesn't turn around? Well, it'll just be like Europe is right now, okay? From a spiritual standpoint, that is not good, okay? So Judah is the same way. Judah is just like Israel, but they just lag behind Israel, all right? So all the bad stuff Israel did that we talked about when we studied Amos and Hosea, Isaiah and Micah are now going to accuse them of the exact same things, okay? So a lot of the things we studied in Hosea and Amos, you will hear Micah saying again, okay? So it's going to sound very similar. So here's some of the mistakes they made. So they viewed God as a protector of the land, that God would take care of them. God was kind of their Santa Claus figure that would make everything okay. Whether or not they did what they were supposed to do was irrelevant. So they're going to engage in what you'd call ritual worship, meaning they'll go to the temple, they'll go to the synagogue, they'll check the box, but it doesn't affect how they actually live their lives or how they interact with other people on a day-to-day basis. So it doesn't really, it's not a mental change about how they actually live their life. They believed the promise of a continuous line of kings of the Davidic dynasty was guaranteed, so they didn't think that they would ever have an end of the David line, or that the country as a whole would cease to exist or go into captivity. They believed that the promises of God were unconditional. In other words, they didn't have to keep their part of the covenant. They just thought God would take care of them regardless of what they did. And they believed in what you might refer to as popular religion instead of true religion. And I'll kind of explain what that means in a second. But you can think about this too. Do we have popular religion in our country today? Well, I'm not going to tell you who this author is. It's a modern day, quote, Christian author, very popular writer and speaker. And these are the titles of probably that person's 10 bestsellers. Now, I'm going to preface this comment by saying I haven't read any of them. I don't know if they're good or bad. So I'm not trashing the individual that wrote these because I don't know enough about it to speak about that. But I will just say this. As you read the titles, do they look like religious books? They look like self-help books. Is the name God in any of those books? The only one you could argue maybe is the fourth one where it says the power of I am, but I don't think I am there is referring to Yahweh. I think it's talking about yourself, okay? So as for the average citizen of the United States, if they want to, quote, learn about Christianity, and they know the name of this individual, where are they going to go to learn about Christianity? Well, they're going to buy one of these books and read it, but is this an accurate reflection of what God actually says in the Bible? I don't know because I haven't read the books, but if I'm making an assumption, I would say no. Okay, this is what you would call popular religion, meaning this is the health, wealth, and goodness doctrine, right? This is not what God actually says. So what is the popular religion going on in Judah? Well, you might be surprised if you've never heard this before. So in Judah, they have discovered a lot of figurines in Jerusalem from the 7th and 8th century BC of a nude goddess that actually is mentioned twice in the Bible. It's mentioned in Jeremiah both times. And it's centered around a cult that flourished in Jerusalem that was driven by the women, okay? So the mother or matriarch of the house actually was the one who led this cult and told the men and the children what to do when they worshiped this individual, okay? So this goddess is called the Queen of Heaven, and most people think they viewed this individual as Yahweh's wife or consort, what you would call a consort. And so a lot of these have been found. If you don't want to see a nude figurine, which it's obviously not very anatomically obvious, but anyway, if you don't want to see that, close your eyes for a second. This is what they look like, okay? This is nothing more than the goddess Ishtar or Asherah, depending on the culture, that permeated the entire ancient Near East, okay? So what is happening, you could go to Assyria and worship this goddess, you could go to Babylon and worship this goddess, you could go to Phoenicia and worship this goddess, and this goddess had made its way into the Judean culture. And in Judah, they called her the Queen of Heaven, but it's the same goddess with the same beliefs that are wrapped up in it. And so the people of Judah actually had gotten into pagan worship just like Israel had, okay? And maybe in a sort of a worse sort of way, because they thought Yahweh had a wife or a consort. Now, how much of the society believed in this? I don't know. Was it 5% or 95%? I don't know. But the two instances that it's mentioned in Jeremiah, and Hosea actually alluded to it in chapter 2, but we didn't make an issue out of it. But the women are actually the ones that are kind of driving this type of worship. Okay, anyway, enough about that. All right, so religious conditions across Judah have become pretty bad, particularly under Ahaz. So they worshipped on the high places. They walked in the way of the kings of Israel. They made molten images for the Baals. They burnt incense. He burned his own son. And they replaced the bronze altar in the temple with a replica of a pagan altar from Damascus. So King Hezekiah tries to remove a lot of this stuff, but he couldn't get rid of all of it. He does get the Asherah poles down and some of the other stuff. So in response to the influence of pagan worship, Micah is going to basically call for what's an eye for an eye type of mentality, whereas, which you can see here. So the people made money by harlotry, so they're going to lose their money to harlotry. In other words, their wealth is going to be taken by another country that doesn't worship God, so their wealth's going to go to Assyria. The rich used evil for gain, so God is going to turn around and use evil against them. The rich drove the poor off their fields, so God's going to turn around and give the fields to Assyria. The rich consumed the poor, so God's going to turn around and let Assyria consume the rich. And I know that was the last spell. These are just some more of the same thoughts. The rich didn't hear the cry of the poor, so God would not hear their cry. The false prophets misused the gift of prophecy, so God would now take that away from them. Zion was built by blood, God would now make it desolate, and the poor were deprived, so God would now deprive the oppressor. So everything evil they did, God's going to allow that evil to come back upon them, basically, is the idea. And we'll just stop there, I think, yeah. So we're actually getting pretty close to the end of the intro. So we should get into the text pretty early in the next class. But does anybody have any questions on this background? So the easy takeaway is all the bad stuff that happened in Israel, it is starting to happen in Judah. And all the stuff Hosea and Amos talked about, Isaiah and Micah is going to also talk about the same stuff as it applies to Judah. So it's basically the same story and the same stuff, just 50, 100 years later down the road that we heard about it already before with Amos and Hosea. Any comments or questions? All right. Good to see everybody.